Have you ever noticed that a lot of Lovecraftian media is set in the early 20th century? I'm not talking about Lovecraft's stories themselves, but rather all the secondary stuff not made by Lovecraft, but made by other people who made their own fiction or video games or board games. Lovecraft set his stories in the time period when he lived, that being in the early 20th century. It would be like a writer of today setting a story in the era now, 2017. Fair enough, makes sense, and all this also excuses the literature made by Lovecraft's friends like Clark Ashton Smith for the same reason. But since then, Lovecraftian content creators tend to favor the 1920s and 1930s when making their stories or games, as if that's a requirement of Lovecraftian horror. The thing is that Lovecraftian horror can be set in any time you like. Technically, you could set a Lovecraftian story in the Stone Age or the far-flung future. It wouldn't in any way violate the standards used to determine if something is Lovecraftian or not. If I think of some examples off the top of my head right now, you have Amnesia: The Dark Descent being set in early 19th century or 18th century, and then you have films like Alien being set in the far future. Both are stories with strong Lovecraftian elements. I must admit that despite knowing that Lovecraftian horror isn't technically limited to a time period, when I think of Lovecraftian horror, I automatically think of that time between the world wars. I imagine that it's the same for some of you too, and certainly for content creators. I think it's simply because certain subgenres of horror really shine in certain settings, whether it be a specific time period or geographical location. Gothic fiction, for example, seems to always be focused on eerie European castles and foreboding villages and forests set in 1899 or some sort of similar date. Zombie horror seems to work best in modern settings, in cities, probably to get the bonus points about social commentary.
What the hell is it? Looks like a shopping center, one of those big indoor malls.
What are they doing? Why do they come here?
Some kind of instinct, memory, what they used to do. This was an important place in their life.
Anyway, when it comes to Lovecraftian stories or video games or board games, I much prefer it to be set in the early 20th century, even though the logical part of me says Lovecraftian horror can technically work in any era. So I try to convince my logical half that Lovecraftian horror is better suited to the 1920s and 1930s for these following reasons. Number 1. It was an era of discoveries. Now, I might be historically ignorant here, but to me it seems like this was a time when new and fascinating discoveries were being made about the world and how it works. Flight was only recently discovered, there was no nuclear power, we hadn't mapped out our solar system yet, and dreams of going to other planets was in the realm of fantasy and science fiction. It was a time when man marveled at his new creations like a narcissist jerking off in front of a mirror. The Titanic, proclaimed an unsinkable ship, got KO'd on its first trip. That doesn't really help my point out, but you get the idea. My point is that man, at this point, must have been filled with a sense of awe about the world around him and the possibilities that are out there. Enter Lovecraftian horror. What if the world around you holds horrific things that are best left undiscovered? Did you know that the discovery of Pluto was what heavily influenced Lovecraft when he invented the nightmarish planet of Yuggoth, adoptive home of the Migo? Inventions of new machines, advances in radio waves and such things surely must have been in Lovecraft's mind when he wrote the story From Beyond, the story of a scientist who invents a wonderful machine that allows humans to see entities which are invisible around us. The story At the Mountains of Madness, although written way after the explorer Roald Amundsen reached the South Pole, it deals with an exploration team discovering something hitherto unknown to humanity. All in all, there's this feeling that I have that in the 1920s and 1930s, it felt like there was a world waiting to be discovered by humanity, and also not just discovered, but to be mastered by humanity. Usurping that idea works very well with Lovecraftian horror, I think. And nowadays, yes, we do make new discoveries and inventions to this day, but now flight is so commercialized, it's an everyday thing. We know about our solar system inside and out, even putting robots on numerous planets already. But when last did we discover something completely unexpected, something completely revolutionary? Not in a long time as far as I can understand. We have social media now, sure, that's the last great invention I think. But most of us just use the time for like shit posting at 3 AM on Pol, or making videos about Lovecraft. Or is that just me again? Anyway, it's hardly comparable to nuclear fusion if you ask me. Number 2. Faraway places were still mysterious. A common Lovecraftian trope in the stories that he wrote is the otherness of foreign lands. Usually this was used by him to talk shit about nationalities that he didn't really like.
They took our jobs!
But it goes a bit further than that. Lovecraft set the nameless city in a random location in Arabia. Robert E. Howard set his story, The Black Stone, deep in the Hungarian forests. While reading either story, one is filled with a sense of wonder about this place that you know exists in reality, but that you know really nothing about. You know Hungary exists, you know Arabia exists, but because you're living in some American city in the 1920s, you don't have a solid conception of these places. You don't know what they really look like, or what the natives of that area look like. You can only guess, right? Because information wasn't so widely available as it is now. Maybe if you go to a library then you can find out more, but do you think the average man is going to do that? I don't think so. Lovecraftian horror, being focused on the horrors of the unknown, can use this to its advantage. Nowadays, I can use my phone to buy an airline ticket to anywhere in the world while lying in bed. And if I don't exactly want to go somewhere, I can just fire up Google Earth, Google Images, or Google Street View and see exactly what's what on the other side of the planet from the comfort of my own home. I can see exactly what is happening in the mysterious oriental city of Beijing. I can gaze in wonder at the designated shitting streets of Mumbai, or watch natives of the jungles of South America produce the handfuls and handfuls of cocaine that I occasionally sample in nightclubs in Europe. My point is that living in this day and age, the world feels so much smaller and less mysterious, which kind of goes against the smallness of man and the mysteries of the dark corners of the earth, which is common in a good Lovecraftian story. The only place on earth that is truly mysterious and unknown to us is the ocean. Did you know that when I googled this, it said only 5% of the ocean has been explored? I don't know if that's true or not, but I'm pretty sure that most of the ocean and what lies underneath is a mystery to us. I hope they find Arlia in my lifetime. That will certainly spice up my life. Number 3. Technology was really primitive back then. World War I was fought with rifles like this. Planes were still made of canvas, and the idea of jet engines was unheard of. And there was no such thing as nuclear bombs or anything as cool as that. Basically, the pinnacle of technology then sucked compared to now. Back then, of course, this stuff was amazing and cutting edge, but in retrospect, it is really laughable. If you took like 100 top-of-the-line soldiers from World War I and put them up against like 20 soldiers of today, I'm betting that the guys from World War I would get their asses kicked. But to me, this sort of highlights just how ineffectual a fight against the Lovecraftian horrors would be. Now, before you go at me about how guns in a Lovecraft story don't do shit, yes, I agree. Guns in a Lovecraft story are useless. No weapon will stop Nyarlathotep, Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, or Azathoth. But, well, let me give you an example. I remember this one film I watched as a kid about a werewolf. It was called Bad Moon. In it, this guy gets attacked by a werewolf, and in self-defense he blows his head off with a shotgun, which kills it. Now, if you know your werewolf lore, you know silver bullets are the only way to kill werewolves. One of the characters even says this to the guy later. Oh, I thought werewolves can only be killed by silver bullets, yet you're telling me you killed it with a shotgun? The point is, technology overcame the monster and usurped the myth that only silver would work. Even as a little kid I thought, okay, maybe a werewolf can survive one lead bullet, and maybe silver is magic to werewolves, but it made perfect sense to me that if a werewolf got his head blown off with a shotgun, silver or not, it's dead. Keeping this notion in mind about how technology overcame the monster, what if we nuked Cthulhu? Keep in mind, nuclear bombs never existed in Lovecraft's time, so he couldn't have factored in such a monstrously destructive device when creating, for example, Cthulhu. What if we put something like the Tsar bomb up Cthulhu's ass? Sure, Cthulhu survived getting rammed by a ship, but a massive nuke? Nukes burn as hot as the interior of the sun when they go off. The shock waves from the Tsar bomb could be felt after their third trip around the world. Would that work? I have a feeling that Lovecraft would say Cthulhu could survive anything because Cthulhu is representative of cosmic horror, and there's nothing that can stop the horror that is intrinsic to life. But my whole point is that I would feel a whole lot less afraid facing off against some Lovecraftian monstrosity with modern technology and weaponry, even if I were to get killed anyway. It would just make me feel confident to have a real gun instead of, a musket or, a one-shot rifle. Number 4. Social justice. There are also some political reasons I think that setting Lovecraftian horror in the 1920s is better. Back then, for better or worse depending who you ask, I think people were more nationalist and had stronger national identities, so if some threat did pose itself against humanity or a country, they would feel more determined to face against it. For example, in The Shadow over Innsmouth, when it's revealed to the US government of the existence of the Deep Ones, they went into Innsmouth and cleaned it out like the SS did in a Warsaw ghetto. There was no fucking around about being diplomatic or pacifist about an existentialist threat, and Lovecraftian horror can be called a type of existentialist horror if you ask me. The reason that this is relevant is that this us versus them mindset complements Lovecraftian horror very well. When some horror does arise, it literally is us or them. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, the Deep Ones wanted to eventually bring Shoggoths onto land and wipe out humanity. In At the Mountains of Madness, the Elder Things fought wars with the Cthulhu spawn and Migo for control of Earth. There is no diplomacy or time for touchy-feely politics with such entities. I think that back in the 1920s, people will be more united against such threat. But now, I can't help thinking that in today's highly politicized and divided setting, especially in America, any discovery of some hidden race like Deep Ones or Migo would result in social justice warriors and leftists doing their best to tell the world how they are oppressed and that we must not be racist towards these creatures. Think I'm talking shit? Well, here I have the perfect example to prove my point. A leftist author by the name of Ruthana Emrys made a short story, a sort of pseudo-sequel to The Shadow over Innsmouth, painting the Deep Ones as a persecuted minority who didn't do nothing, and the government who tackled the problem in Innsmouth as being like the US government locking up the Japanese in World War II. Elizabeth Baird did something very similar with Shoggoths in her story Shoggoths in Bloom. I thought about doing a video about that subject but decided to get drunk and play Skyrim instead. In conclusion, I should just point out again that a Lovecraftian story can be set in any time period that you think of. These are just my personal reasons for preferring that era, that being the 1920s and 30s, over other eras. After literally years of stories being set in the early 20th century, it now feels kind of off to set a story in the 21st century. But I want to go on record saying that innovation and violation of the norm can result in beautiful creations. These are just 4 reasons I could think of at the time. So what do you think? Do you think Lovecraftian horror is better suited to the 1920s and 30s? Or do you not really care when your Lovecraftian story is set? And if you have an answer, tell me that in the comments and why you think that way. Anyway, thanks for watching and stay Eldritch. P.S. I'll probably never get another chance to talk about that film, Bad Moon, that I mentioned earlier on, but can we just take a moment to realize how fucking alpha the dog in that film is? This badass German Shepherd sees a gigantic werewolf attacking his family, and he doesn't give a fuck. He runs right in and starts fighting with it. He gets half destroyed, but he doesn't care. The werewolf slashes at his face and body, flesh is bitten off of him. He doesn't give up like some pussy poodle. And then, the best scene in the film. This poor dog staggers to his feet and basically says, "Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker." He smashes the werewolf right out the window. What an awesome movie scene. German Shepherds, man. Truly the master race of dogs.